All good? Right. I am thrilled to be here. Thank you, Kara. Thank you, Caden, for inviting me and the WI for this opportunity. I am, when I get excited about things, I talk quickly. So I will try to slow down because my sister says no one can listen as fast as I talk. So you will have no idea how delighted I am to be here this evening. When asked, I accepted with glee, as I have long wanted to be a part of your community. As this is our first meetup, my plan is to introduce you to the importance of craft and community in my life before and after I moved to Alberta. My goal, to tell you why I believe Alberta's unique craft history, which includes the WI, continues to offer an exceptional model for community development today. Now, when I say craft, I'm talking about the textile crafts, the things that we're doing and what you're doing this evening, crochet, etc. But I'm going to use the word craft. Tonight's talk touches on only some of the rabbit holes I have explored since moving to Alberta. But before I begin, I have something to ask of you. I would like you to consider what craft means to you. I know it's something you do, but is it a creative outlet, a leisure activity, a form of therapy, an obsession, the means to an end? How has craft insinuated its way into your life? Just how crafty is craft? For instance, how do you explain why an anticipated Friday night out is to be spent with a crochet hook? What are the connective threads that pull your craft narrative together? So, my story, how clever crafty craft, insinuated its way into my life. I grew up in Ottawa. My mom and dad were from Hamilton, which is why I know about Adelaide Hoodless. My parents were married during the Depression, and as a result, make, do, and mend is in my blood. My earliest accomplishment, threading a needle. My special treat, sorting the button bag. My dad was a pragmatist. He could fix anything and was a firm believer in learning by doing. It was from him that I learned about color theory, the arts and crafts movement, and William Morris's most familiar maxim, and I quote, "Never put into your house what you do not know to be useful and believe to be beautiful." Morris also argued that a skilled craftsman could invest ordinary things with art. That's what we do. My sister and I describe ourselves, we're very close, but we describe ourselves as only children. There's a 12-year age gap. And I always say, Mom practiced on her, read a great deal about child psychology, and then had me. Whereas my sister hated having to wear homemade clothes, Mom reframed the clothes she made for me as handmade. She also let me know that I was one of the lucky ones. Other children had to have store-bought stuff for them. I don't know if Mom read Nellie McClung's 1936 autobiography, Clearing in the West, My Own Story, but in it, McClung provided me with unexpected insights into the evolving attitudes towards traditional handwork on the prairies, where pioneer life is not in the far distant past. In the book, Nellie's mother explains to a visitor that at first, the ability to create such work was regarded as a signifier of domestic skill and resourcefulness. Then, a source of creative pleasure, and finally, a site of some embarrassment, confiding that the younger generation, and I quote, are a little bit ashamed of the homemade stuff. In fact, Nellie appears rather smug when her brother describes her as not being able to piece quilts or crochet or knit, for at the forefront of this mid-century conversation is an understanding that traditional crafts, spinning, weaving, knitting, crochet, etc., were destined to become residents of the past. Their visitor laments, too bad, for they would be great treasures in 40 years or less. You would be asked to loan them for art exhibits. However, this was 1936, and by referencing her inability to do handwork, Nellie McClung was subtly positioning herself as a modern, urban woman. If my sister was the hoyden, the wild one, I was the dutiful daughter, the good girl, too embarrassed to be caught breaking rules or stepping outside lines, never late and seldom questioning those in power. I was an average student working part-time and studying art history, but I never seemed to fit. I was married and slightly older than my cohort. It took almost 10 years at 3 different universities to complete my degree. We did a lot of moving. While attending the University of Waterloo, the art history class assignment was to interview a contemporary Canadian artist. I thought it perfectly reasonable to meet with Mennonite quilters. At Concordia, when the brief was to create a 2-dimensional black and white interlocking pattern for a design class, I showed up with a quilt. In both cases, my art instructors were appalled and I was mortified. We are all products of the era in which we are living, and in the late 70s, modernism still reigned supreme in studio class. Art, with a capital A, was conceptual, abstract, and large, to be displayed in white cube galleries and critically reviewed by those in the know. The artists in my textbooks were most often male and white. What wasn't art was also made clear. It was not craft. Craft was dismissed for being decorative, utilitarian, and domestic. Now, traditional and modern craft, of course, was being made and sold, and craft fairs were everywhere, but there was no place for craft in the world of mainstream art history. Culture was segregated: highbrow, middlebrow, lowbrow. Only when I started graduate school did I find direction in a community, led by an advisor who did not think Canadian art was limited to painting and sculpture. In his class, I was introduced to a new generation of British revisionist historians who sought to reimagine the historical narrative, and have an alternative art history that would include women and I gasped here, textiles. I read Rosika Parker's The Subversive Stitch, 1984, as I would a novel. I was intrigued and incensed, discovering many of the familiar craft biases were rooted in the distant past, the 19th century. I learned that middle-class Victorian women were encouraged to embroider as the practice was seen to inculcate femininity, as handwork requires patience and persistence, typical feminine skills. It produced decorative objects, like the women themselves, for the home where they belonged. Even the position of the body sewing was seen to be inherently feminine, passively seated, head bent, eyes cast down. On the other hand, when the British suffragettes wanted to fly under the radar as they traveled to rallies, they simply traveled with a work bag of yarn. Pulling out their knitting or crochet made them invisible. For my MA, I chose to research and write a thesis on Quebec embroidered samplers. Nonetheless, my pragmatic upbringing meant I needed to know how it was done before I could write about it. Here I am speaking of the value of tacit knowledge, knowledge of the hands. I suspect that many of you do not have to think about what you are doing when you knit or crochet. Your hands know. When you look at a work, you process not only the aesthetics, but the maker's commitment to the medium. You don't have to like something, but you recognize if it's well made, if it's simple or complex, if it conforms or it breaks with tradition. In other words, you are connoisseurs. You have an intimate knowledge of the medium. The only downside is finding someone who understands and shares your enthusiasm, hence stitch and sip. The first year of grad school, I not only embroidered, but I bought a loom, learned to weave, and took a course in textile chemistry offered at McGill's Macdonald College. By the time I graduated, admittedly 9 years later, I always say I did a degree a decade. 9 years later, I was a sessional instructor in art history and had honed the skill of reading between the lines. I was fully engaged in drawing attention to the erasure of women and craft media from Canadian art history. I was thrilled to be teaching the history of textile art, but one day thought, why not a PhD? And if I was going to dream, why not dream big, a scholarship? My topic, this was for a PhD, my topic, Canadian fashionable domestic embroidery and the transference of cultural identity. I was giddy when I was awarded a full Commonwealth scholarship to study at the Royal College of Art in England, but sobered when I told an academic colleague, and her immediate response was, "You're too old." Needless to say, she is not part of my community. Community has numerous meanings. It may be a group of people living in the same place or having a particular characteristic in common. However, my favorite go-to is the Oxford English Dictionary, and it defines community as, and I quote, "a group of people who share the same interests, pursuits, or occupation, especially when distinct from those of the society in which they live." End of quote. I like this definition as it provides us, us, with a rather defiant identity. Indeed, I would argue that today, to make something by hand is to push back against technology and consumer culture. Dare I say, crochet as an act of dissent? A recently coined term, craftivism, sees craft as a vehicle for social activism, but this is not new. Suffragettes embroidered banners, Gandhi hand-spun cotton to inspire self-sufficiency in India, and more than 20 years ago, Janet Morton sewed together old sweaters from Goodwill to make a house-sized cozy for a small, abandoned, dilapidated house in Toronto. This was a visual lament about homelessness. While I grew up knowing about Adelaide Hoodless, I had not realized that she saw in craft an obvious means of creating communities of interest. In 1900, she reflected, quote, "Up to the present time, little effort has been made towards developing a distinctly Canadian character in the various arts and crafts," end of quote. The WI took up this challenge, working together as communities of makers to employ craft to good effect for home and country. The proceedings of the second Alberta WI conference, held in Edmonton in 1916, shows how the organization of clubs was well considered to have not only a social but a practical side, and I quote, "for the purpose of interesting girls and women in the products of the farm and to reduce the high cost of living. Craft would help." End of quote. Early documents reveal that the members made a point of reaching out to newcomers, the immigrants, helping them to acclimatize to prairie life. They took them shopping, they showed them how to bank. But for many, it was craft that formed the common ground as bonds were formed and problems solved over displays of knitting, embroidery, weaving, and crochet. They were speaking the same language, even if they were not speaking the same language. The WI has a long has used traditional craft knowledge for humanitarian purposes for many years. Such initiatives are often inspired by conflict and war. Signature quilts raised money for the Red Cross during the World War I, and members have knitted who knows how many pairs of socks for soldiers in the past century. A friend from Hannah remembers that in her 1950s grade 4 class, they crocheted squares, which the ladies sewed together to make blankets for Korean orphans. There have been many revivals of interest in craft over the past century, one marker being a sudden appearance of magazines and pattern books. And you know that if you go online and look at Amazon, all the new books that are coming out now. The late 20s saw the value of handicrafts become a national concern, in part driven by the environmental devastation that heralded the dirty 30s, and in part a response to a new industry, tourism. The Oyen News reported, and I quote the title, "One result of the immense tourist traffic in Canada is a revival of home industries." John Murray Gibbons was the publicity director of the CPR, and he worked with the Women's Institute, the Canadian Handicraft Guild, and provincial governments to promote tourism and regional art by mounting uniquely regional fairs. The Great West Folk Art, or folk song and folk dance festivals featured handicraft and were held in Winnipeg in 1928, Regina in 1929, and Calgary in 1930. It was expected that visitors would purchase locally made goods, of work as a visual affirmation of their ability to travel. You had to have money to travel. Even Chatelaine magazine would find a place for rural homespun in the modern urban home. In the language of the day, the handicraft exhibitions were about diversity and inclusion, for there were Indigenous, settler, and immigrant contributions. In fact, Canadian identity would be given form in 1938 when Gibbons, the CPR public relations man, published his text, Canadian Mosaic, The Making of a Northern Nation. In it, he presented Canada as a multicultural collage or a mosaic rather than the American melting pot. Significantly, in his book, Canadian Mosaic, Gibbons describes the WI as the cement holding the country together in times of war and in peace. When we moved to Alberta in 2002, I was ill prepared. But my husband was thrilled with his new and challenging position at the U of C and already pulling on his boots. And I do not mean that metaphorically. He was born in Castor, grew up in Edmonton, did his undergraduate degrees at the U of A. His grandparents on both sides were pioneers, immigrants. His roots were showing. He started at the university in July while I packed up the house in Ottawa. The cats and I flew into Calgary on the 1st of August. It was snowing. It was not an auspicious start. Fortunately, I was hired to teach art history at ACAD, now AU Arts. And the art college began as a Provincial Institute of Technology and Art, the TEC, in 1916, and has undergone many incarnations, but it has always offered a combination of art, craft, and design classes. I was struck by the exceptionally strong presence of craft media, glass, ceramics, jewelry, and textiles, and I knew I wanted to be part of this community. But what could I bring to the conversation? After all, a community involves sharing, but craft is crafty. One day after class, a student presented me with my first Alberta rabbit hole. She asked me about the Marion Nicol Gallery. Who was Marion Nicol? I know I sounded knowledgeable. I'd spent the week before in the library reading everything I could about Alberta art when I explained that Nicol was a well-known Calgarian artist, an abstract expressionist, born in 1909, died in 1985, who had studied art at the Ontario College of Art in Toronto, at the Tech, and at an art college in London. I explained that Nicol was best known for having broken barriers, a successful woman artist, the first female art instructor at the Tech, and one of the few prairie artists to have found favor with a New York critic. But even as I recounted the facts, I began to have questions. I had felt a connection to Nicol when I read that she too had studied in London. But while much had been written about her, no one had commented on her choice of school, the Central School of Arts and Craft. The only fact given in everything I had read was that she'd likely studied portraiture with Duncan Grant, a British artist then teaching at Central. To my mind, this seemed odd, as everyone knows that she painted landscapes, not portraits. More significantly, I knew that Grant was not only a painter and a portrait painter, but a decorator and a textile designer. And given it was the School of Art and Craft, I began to dig deeper. Had she studied craft? Might she have taught or even made craft? Was she the reason that craft was so important in the college, even in the province? Fortunately, Nicol's archive, made up of journals and class notes and letters and newspaper clippings and photographs, was donated to the Glenbow and easily accessed. My very first visit revealed that there was an alternative history to be told, one I could narrate through the eyes of craft. She had in fact studied craft in Toronto and in London and taught crafts at the Tech. She never taught painting, only craft. There were photographs of her batiks, her leatherwork, her jewelry, and even a photo of Nicol in a batik muumuu wearing chunky silver jewelry and posed in front of her paintings. An undated photograph of a display panel reads, M. Nicol, sculpture to wear, gold, silver, and bronze. In hindsight, it is clear that this first generation of Alberta art historians had an agenda. They were intent on establishing Nickel's credentials as a modern female artist who had succeeded in a man's world, and that, in modernist terms, meant painting. They saw no need to muddy the waters by mentioning her craft practice. But Marion Nickel was a successful painter. That she was a successful painter is not a question, but she was much more. Her jewelry was featured at the 1958 World's Fair in Brussels as an example of Canadian modernism. Her batiks were exhibited across Canada and the United States alongside her paintings. Her craft work is aesthetic of its time. It is modern, it is expressive, just like her paintings. Nickel lived a life that pushed boundaries and broke with convention, but what needs to be known is that craft and its history were an integral part of her professional life. And if Marion could be erased from history, what about others? There must be others, a veritable warren of rabbit holes. 1967 and Canada's centennial saw a growing interest in Canadian history. For their centennial project, the WI decided to publish a book. A Heritage of Canadian Handicraft maps out the long-standing relationship between the WI and craft practices across Canada. The foreword reads, and I quote, "Among the many phases of our program is our deep and lasting interest in and love for the crafts. We feel the preservation of these crafts can, in great measure, be attributed to our homemakers. It is only natural, therefore, that we should wish their history preserved." In preparation for tonight's talk, I had reread the chapter on Alberta craft, but upon taking note of the contributors list, I began to hum, "It's a small world after all." In the Nickel archive is a carbon copy of a typewritten missive entitled Craft in Alberta, which had been sent to a Mrs. J. L. Richards. I had not made the connection at the time, but now know that Mrs. Richards of Red Deer was the WI contributor to the text. She had obviously consulted Nickel, the well-known craft instructor, and at the time she was well-known. And Nickel's summary underpins much of the chapter on Alberta craft. So how crafty is craft? I was hooked and have continued to study Alberta craft. I relish the fact that craft appears as a shapeshifter with multiple identities, depending on the context. Nellie McClung's musings were of her time and reflect the mid-century bias that attempted to position craft as an artifact of the past era, proof of pioneer resourcefulness, but no longer current in a modern industrial age. Even today, some consider the handmade as old-fashioned, a site of some embarrassment. But as I said, this might also be interpreted as a push back against technology and consumer culture. Against the odds, craft has continued to flourish. Craft has even used the internet and social media to find a new and appreciative community. Craft inspires community, and in Alberta, its roots are deep. I think of craft as an ongoing conversation. It is how we tell our story. It serves as the way we start a dialogue and as a means by which we engage. Craft groups, like yours, continue to offer a safe place where anxieties can be vocalized, where problems can be addressed. Such gatherings are a mix of emotional labor and leisure. The WI has long recognized craft as a catalyst in community building, and it is my hope that craft will also serve as a model for the Athabasca University project, Communities in Transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was great. We have some time if anyone had any questions or any dialogue to share.
If your husband was from Castor, you must know where Alliance is.
I do. He was very impressed. He goes, "Yeah, I know exactly where that is." And I said, "We've even driven it through. We went sort of to Castor to see where his family from. Castor, Galahad, that's where his family was."
Yeah, we have a couple of members from Galahad here tonight.
Okay, good. That was the Fullers. So his family.
Fullers. And this is a Wagnus that's here tonight.
Okay. Quite fun. No, one of the best things I found when I was looking at Marion Nickel, I had been teaching craft history at the college, and one of my students got very excited about her, and she went to Bowness, where Nickel had lived, the Nickel family, husband and wife had lived. I mean, they'd left in the 80s. She drove to Bowness, parked on the street where they lived, hadn't told me she was doing this, and started to approach anybody that she thought looked ancient. Right. And then she helped a man with a walker across the street. And she said to him, she asked him about the Nichols, and he went, "Oh, you mean Jim and Marion? Yeah, sure. Come on in." And he pulled out a green Fentex octopus that Marion Nickel had made for his daughter. And I just cracked up and thought, if those art historians had seen that, all of their horror would have come to fruition, because they green octopus Fentex is everything they would have hated. I was thrilled. And I brought in my very favorite piece of, well, not my, yeah, probably one of my favorite pieces of a doily. You like this one? He's got swans. So when you put him on the table, all the swans stand up or swim up and face in. So you can put your cake in the middle of it and all the swans take a bite. There we are.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. If you don't have any questions, I will leave you to your tea. I envy you this. My mother-in-law, who was a bateman, taught me from Alberta, didn't teach me how to crochet. I was learning how to crochet when we were in England, but my father-in-law spent his whole life laughing at my crocheting, because no matter what I started, I turned it into something else, because it was always wrong. I would start off making an egg cozy and it would become a hat. I would start off making a hat and I would make egg cozies or a tea cozy. I always felt I had to know how to do it so I could write about it, but I didn't necessarily know how to do it well, right? And I think my studio teachers kept saying to me, "And you're sure you're going to be an art historian?" And then they would sort of push me out of their class and say, "Go on, go on." But I would like to have more contact with the WI.
I'm from
That was
Ontario.
fascinating, Jennifer. Please don't leave yet. That was fascinating.
Okay, good.
I'm in the Taves. I'm in James River. I'm president of WI. And yeah, I'd like to talk to you further about getting more involved with WI. It's interesting that you were mentioning the Nickel Arts Museum, because my stepfather was a watercolorist and he taught at the University of Calgary. And my mother was a textile artist. So it's quite possible you might have
What are
run
their
into them
names?
other. Bushman.
Okay,
Last name is Bushman. Leo and Jennifer.
okay.
Yeah.
I'm writing
But,
things
yeah,
down.
Yeah, I'd love to talk to you some more about that. I'll get your information from Kara,
Absolutely.
and yeah, maybe we can connect somehow and get you more involved with WI. That'd be wonderful. Thank you
would
so
love it.
much. It was a fascinating talk.
Good. I had a
Hi.
good time putting it together.
Hi, I'm from Ontario, and I'm kind of fascinated with your sweater that you got on. Is
My
that
buttons? It's all
Yeah.
buttons.
very nice?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I put it on for you especially.
Yeah.
We have what we call the textile handshake. You must know that one, where everybody sort of reach out to feel cloth, feel scarves. So we sort of call it the textile handshake. Ooh, silk. Ooh, you know.
Very nice.
Did you have any other questions there, Linda, from your location, or Diane?
Ladies
Okay,
are all
well,
sitting
thank
here
you.
smiling. Yeah.
Dead silence. I know. You'll think of things and you can talk about it afterwards.
Yeah.
Sort of figure out how craft influenced. I mean, I just putting this paper together, this talk together, I really realized how craft really had been very crafty and had steered me to where I am. I never started to think I will be a textile historian when I grow up. Right? It's not something you do. And to be doing a doctorate on embroidery was something rather marvelous. And when my husband was, when we moved from Montreal to Ottawa, sort of returned to Ottawa, the people that had hired him, the government, said that they would try to find me a job. And then they finally, they said to me, you know, what is your doctorate in? And I told them, and they just laughed and said, no, what is it really in? I sort of wanted to slug them, you know, but yeah, That's why it's so fun to talk to you. All right. I will wish you well. You can get my email address. All right. Happily share it, Kara. And I will wish you well, ladies. Have a marvelous evening, and I envy the cookies. How come one group was eating and the others weren't?
We'll fix that. Okay, thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you. You take care. Have fun.
Okay.